Hello, I'm Marc Newkirk. We're living in a time when disclosures are coming fast and furious to the public. There seems to be a tremendous amount of light pouring into the world and nothing can be hidden. The truth is coming out all over, and it can be a little bit confusing to see all of the pieces of information coming forward, much of it very surprising, and when you just look at it piecemeal, sometimes it can be a little scary when you haven't gotten all the pieces of information that all fit so you really know what's going on. Well, I'd like to offer you some perspective on the disclosures that are coming forth in this time, in case they're of some use to you. This perspective, which I'll be offering you, will be on recent and upcoming disclosures, some disclosures of which I know will happen but aren't happening yet. We'll be talking about relevant history, including some ancient history, and we'll be talking about the implications of those disclosures and the things that are coming to light. The information is derived from recent presentations of other people, from announcements of people, from channelings, from data exposure in general that's coming into the world through mostly the internet, to some extent the news media, but some of it also comes from a discipline called remote viewing, which some of you who've heard some of my previous lectures or been exposed to that technology or discipline in the past would understand what that means. It's basically going within yourself to get information. It also is, in some cases, information which I've received directly via inspiration and introspection. Some of it also is from memory, this lifetime and past lifetimes. The presentation I'm giving you is without attachment. I'm not wedded to whether people agree with me or don't agree with me, and I certainly encourage you to take what I give you as well as what anybody gives you and expose it to your own inner truth meter, if you will, and whatever is useful to you, that's great, and if it's not useful to you, disregard it. I'd like to give some special appreciation and credit to 4 people who have provided some particularly useful information that is included or woven into some aspects of this presentation. One is Douglas Vogt, who is the director of Diehold Foundation and is putting out numerous disclosures in this time. The excellent work which he and others have been doing on the subject of solar activity, global warming, and other subjects. Brad Johnson of New Earth Teachings, who has channeled several future versions of himself to provide information which is appearing to be highly accurate in some cases. A guy named Jimmy through Bright Insights, which is the name of his YouTube channel, where he's giving people some insight on a number of observations which he's made in connecting data which needs to be connected, some of which I find to be highly accurate also. Also Daryl Lanka of Bashar.org, who also is channeling his future self and at times provides some very useful pieces of insight. So I'd like to thank all of them and many other people who've contributed to this presentation. One of the discoveries coming out in our time is the existence of a universal clock cycle. This is quite interesting. At this point, I would say it has been scientifically proven that there is such a thing across the entire universe. There is a timing cycle of certain events. This first came to my awareness through Douglas Vogt's work, which is quite excellent. He has analyzed work of many others. The aspect of the clock cycle that is particularly being focused on here is that stars, apparently all stars, at least all of the ones in the observable universe today, appear to go through a universal nova cycle. The phenomenon appears to occur every 12,068 years. That's a number that was calculated from Douglas Vogt from a bunch of inputs, which I think is accurate. Solar novas, which occur on this regular timing, apparently universally with all stars, involve the star heating up. In this case, our sun heats up periodically. It increases its brilliance and it ejects a high-speed dust cloud The dust cloud dissipates radially over time from the star that's novaing and moves outward. It dissipates radially until it finally occupies an equilibrium position out at some gravitational distance from the original star, and parts of the dust cloud, of course, are absorbed via gravity into planets in addition to their mass. When the sun puts out this dust cloud, initially the dust cloud shields the sun's visibility to the surrounding stars for a period. So you can't see that star from elsewhere in the universe for a while because the dust cloud is obscuring it. Novas are accompanied by planetary magnetic polar reversals. That is, the planets which circulate around the sun periodically undergo magnetic shifts where their poles reverse, and when the poles reverse, there's a consequent reversal of rotation of the planets. Douglas Vogt gives some basis for concluding that, and I'll talk a little bit about how it is that they do that. It was interesting to me that there was this realization that in the universe there's a periodic time when the planets are rotating in one direction and then they turn around and rotate in the other direction. It was interesting to me because I've been involved, as some of you know from previous lectures, with a technology called light field, which you see here in the slide, which is a consciousness-raising technology. But there's a piece of that technology which involves a rotation, a rotating part of the technology that periodically has to be rotated in the opposite direction. It was very interesting to me that that's exactly what happens with the planets, that periodically they seem to go through a sort of rewind cycle. When I came to understand this, I found this was quite fascinating. There's a fingerprint of novas, which is this dust cloud, which moves out radially from the star and eventually occupies an equilibrium position. NASA has talked about there being a dust cloud called a Kuiper belt, which is located in the solar system outside of Neptune. That Kuiper belt is a dust cloud that is the result of previous novas moving out and eventually occupying that equilibrium position in the solar system. On 8,675,000 known stars, data exhibits a gap in locations that are multiples of 12,000 light years distant in the observable universe. You find that there are stars all over the place, but at 12,000 light years, they haven't identified any. And at multiples of 12,000 light years, they haven't identified any. All the way out to over 300,000 light years away, there's this gap in the data. And that's the evidence that there is this clock cycle in the universe where every 12,000 years the suns go through this nova and they become obscured by their dust clouds. There are stars out there 12,000 light years and multiples of that, of course, but you don't observe them because their dust clouds obscure them. It appears that our government has been aware of the phenomenon now since 1958. They don't appear to have been informing the public of that. They haven't told the public about it because they're concerned that the public will panic over it, and which is one of the reasons for having this lecture right now. NASA appears to have been aware of the relationship between solar activity, what's called the Gleisberg cycle, which is solar sunspot activity and bursts of solar energy, an accumulation of 8 solar cycles, and then it seems to start over to another cycle. And NASA is well aware of the Gleisberg cycle, and the Gleisberg cycle ending 1958 was showing that the solar activity was increasing. It was getting hotter. There was more radiation coming out of the sun. It appears our government has known full well that there were novas in the past and there would be in the future, and the phenomenon of global warming. Well, we've been hearing about global warming for a long time and all this scientific baloney that it's due to the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect appears to have been nothing more than a technically unsound cover story to hide the truth about what causes global warming. And when I say technically unsound, there have been plenty of people who have done the calculations of what happens to the greenhouse effect, and it does not explain global warming, but the Gleisberg cycle explains it perfectly, and the nova cycle that occurs periodically has this cycle where the solar activity begins to heat up, begins to become more and more aggressive, and ends in a nova every 12,000 years. Well, if there were previous novas where the sun got very hot and its activity increased, is there evidence of it out there? Well, actually, yeah, there's quite a bit of evidence out there. One piece of evidence, which I've known about for quite some time but had not tied to this, you're looking at Dunedin Castle in Scotland, and it was noticed that in numerous of these castles, these old castles and old forts, in Ireland, in Scotland, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, there has been a phenomenon where many of these forts that are old stone forts have obviously been exposed to a tremendous amount of heat. That is, rocks are melted on the outside and glazed, and things which are not of that kind of time frame don't exhibit that. How did they get glazed? Well, if you look into it on the internet, you get a lot of nonsense. It's technically unsound. Well, there must have been weapons and fires. They must have been attacked. Well, these are entirely glazed. The idea that you can take that rock and you can build any kind of a wood fire or natural fire that would normally occur and glaze the surface of it, that doesn't happen unless it's a whole lot hotter. It has to be somewhere between 800 and 1200 degrees centigrade, which is very hot. Red heat, for example, normally that you would see, it might be 600 degrees, you know. I mean, this is really hot. Bright orange, yellow heat is 1200 degrees centigrade. Anyway, it wasn't just Dunedin Castle. Here's another one, Dun Carloway Broch in Lewis, Scotland. Also glazed surfaces, close-up of, this is a close-up. If you see the sort of whitish look in this surface of Shieldfoot Castle, that's like glass, a glassy surface. It's like reflective. It's been fused on the outside of it. This is a fort at Skellig Michael, which is an island off of Ireland, which similarly has melted surfaces, and you can see from the inset there, the shiny pink surface where the rock was melted. What caused that melting? All of these cases were the most previous solar nova of our sun. Here in this picture, you're looking at a big mound, and people have heard generally of the mound dwellers, and an awful lot of the public information that's put out where these mounds were built as burial chambers. Look at the size of this mound. You don't need to build a mound that big to bury somebody. People were busier than to have that kind of time on their hands. These mounds were built as attempts to try to survive the previous nova. There were people that knew that this would happen, and they built these enormous mounds in an attempt to do that. This is the Grave Creek Mound in Moundsville, West Virginia. There are more than 400 mounds in West Virginia. Here's another one in Chillicothe, Ohio, so-called Mound City. You can see a number of mounds here. Often they've been found to have within them skeletons, and so they said, oh, well, these were burial places. They weren't burial places. Those were people that didn't survive the nova. And often these mounds had also provisions within them that people had packed in there, food and other clothing and other things. So it was obvious they were living in there and attempting to survive. Well, one of the problems is if you happen to be in a nova which got very, very hot, the atmosphere can get very, very hot to the point that you can't breathe it. People still need air. So here's another mound that was built attempting to survive the previous nova in Marksville, Ohio, and another example, the Williamson Mound in Butler County, Ohio. There are many, many of these mounds, and not just in this country, other countries as well. That's why they were there, was the nova. There's a forecast that Douglas Vogt made of the timing of the next nova in October of 2046 for a variety of reasons. I am of the opinion that his date probably is correct. Now, depending upon what you think is going to happen in the nova, you can now imagine why the government maybe doesn't want to tell everybody about this nova. But actually, one of the reasons for this lecture is I think that the assumption that it's going to be a disaster for everyone is false. There are novas, and they happen along a cycle, and they can be very hot, and they can be disastrous depending upon the situation. But the idea that they have to be, and they always are, I think is actually not correct. Some of you who've seen some of my previous lectures may have seen this slide. It was a slide that I put together based upon a concept which was espoused by others as well, that there is an evolutionary information flow. Actually, Douglas Vogt has a theory about information being the currency of the universe, although his ideas about how it actually works are somewhat different than mine. But basically, what I have come to understand and have lectured on in the past is that all evolution actually comes by virtue of information that flows from the source or the creator to the universal suns, through them to the galactic suns, through them to the stars, through them to what are the planetary suns. So anyway, this is something which is the information flow, and the information flow is itself life force. Said differently, it's love. Actually, love is the currency of the universe and is the thing that creates everything, sustains everything, motivates everything as well. They are not only the same, they are intelligent. That's an important feature here. There has been in some of the discussion about the nova and the realization that there's a clock cycle, a concept put out that this is just a computer. Well, it may have a clock cycle, but it is not just a computer. In fact, the information that is flowing to all of the life forms in the universe is changing continually, and it's changing based upon the needs of the individual life elements as well as the collective life elements and the collective consciousness as well. And so the idea that the novas are caused by this flow of life force, I would say absolutely. But the idea that they're all the same, no way. They respond actually to the individual and collective consciousness. The creator is not separate from the creation. It's completely plugged into, causes and maintains it. They're not separate. So these information flows are fundamentally causal. They cause everything. They cause the existence of operating systems. That's kind of a computer concept, but it applies very well to universes and different theaters of activity. The operating systems are not all the same. Any of you who've heard me lecture on dimensions, I talked about the fact that the operating systems are not the same dimension to dimension or galaxy to galaxy or location to location. What I mean by that is different things are possible in different locations and in different dimensions. So all of that is a matter of programming that's specific to the individual situation. Things do go through these clock cycles where they're rewound, so to speak, where they're regenerated, because in fact the populations that occupy them many times, as has been the case, for example, with our civilization, abuse those theaters, and they need regenerated, and they do get regenerated, and that's one of the things that these nova cycles are about. Every 75,000 years, for example, which is like 6 of these nova cycles approximately. This theater, the third dimensional theater of the Earth's location, goes through a big overhaul and drives it back to its primordial state and repairs it. Those nova cycles are about the need to rewind it periodically every 12,000 years, and to a bigger degree every 75, and a degree in between in 25,000, depending upon what's been going on there, not just blindly, but depending upon what's been going on there with the collective consciousness and the planet, which is conscious itself. So evolution is about programming. Species arriving and leaving, they're all about programming, and that's happening big time in our time. Not only are species leaving, they're arriving, new ones that we've never seen before. It's happened in the past. That's how the dinosaurs got here. They didn't just go from bacteria to these giant behemoths. These things were all programmed in here. Our bodies, our cells, our DNA, they're all programmed. They're all programmed, and our DNA in this particular time is changing. It's being reprogrammed by the information flow. So information fields create programming. They are the precursor to all manifestation. Everything that exists started off with a program, with a thought form, with an idea, and then it becomes manifested. The Russians discovered in the 1980s that these information fields existed, that they were non-physical, and that they had certain properties, and they developed a tremendous amount of understanding about information fields and technologies based upon them. One of the top former Soviet scientists, I was fortunate enough to have him as a partner for a time, and he shared with me considerable learning about those fields, how they worked, what the properties were. Well, one of the properties was a torsional property. A torsional property, it's a concept, it's an idea. This isn't something physical, but it involves something like twisting. It sounds like something mechanical because it creates a result which is somewhat mechanical. Torsion, that property, causes something called chirality or twisting. It's the reason why molecules frequently are chiral in their form, some of the organic molecules and others. You follow the structure and it's twisting. Our DNA has multiple strands and they're all twisting. That's chirality, that property. It comes from the property of torsion fields. Seashells show that. Vines wrapping around trees show that. Tree trunks have chirality. If you've looked at cedar trees, for example, it's very easy to see from the bark and if you strip the bark off, the wood twists as it's growing. Vortexes, all vortexes have a property of chirality. Portals have a property of chirality. Those are caused by information that has a torsional property. All orbits around electrons around nuclei, or planets around suns, or suns around galaxies, and galaxies around central suns, all those orbits are caused by torsional properties of information fields. All spins are caused by it. Subatomic particles have spins, right-handed and left-handed. Planets have a spin which is right-handed and left-handed. They turn one way, then eventually they turn the other way. Spin creates the property of magnetism. Magnetic fields are created by spins. Gravitation is created by spins. Levitation is created by spins. Levitation is similar to gravitation, except it is a different kind of spin. So that torsional properties of information fields causes spins. One of the puzzling things is the Earth and its rotation, and the polarity and the rotation is toward the east. When you get a polar reversal, when the magnetic field starts to decay, which it is right now, it becomes weaker, not linearly, it's accelerating asymptotically, and it doesn't have to go all the way before, in fact, the whole field flips, and that's what will happen in 2046. When that does, and the North Pole is south and the South Pole is north, it will cause the Earth's rotation to stop and begin to rotate the opposite direction. And when it rotates the opposite direction, there's a lot of consequence to the Earth stopping rotating and rotating the opposite direction. But what causes that is the information field that's flowing into it, which causes the magnetic field, which is a vortex through it, and that magnetic field reversing actually causes the rotation of the planet to stop and go the other way. So that's what does happen and will happen in a magnetic polar reversal. Well, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize, and certainly if you look at some of the history of the planet, it's what's happened on here, to realize that, wow, this can be a pretty exciting event. If the Earth stops rotating in one direction and it rotates the other, it's a bigger deal than just, oh, the sun gets up on the other side. And, you know, we're facing the east looking at the sunsets and facing the west looking at the sunrises. It's not just that. The sun, when it's rotating, it's doing more, the surface is moving more than 1,000 miles an hour. The air on the surface is heavily influenced by that rotation. And there's a jet stream that runs right now from west to east, etc. But the air masses are heavily influenced. They're also influenced by thermal considerations. But the water, of course, right now, I mean, there's such a thing as, quote, still water on the surface plenty of times. And yeah, the wind moves it sometimes, but it's, you know, not any big deal. But imagine that you stop moving and the air is going 1,000 miles an hour, you know, in one direction. A wind 1,000 miles an hour can do really quite a lot. The question is, what's actually still around on the surface when you have 1,000 mile an hour wind whizzing by? And what happens to the water? Well, the water has a momentum. And if you were to stop suddenly, stop the planet suddenly, the water's going to keep going. It's still held to the surface via gravity, but it's still moving in the former direction. And so it's going to tend to spill up onto the land until the momentum decreases, and then it runs back the other way. In a polar magnetic reversal, the magnetic field, as I say, collapses over time and then reforms with the north and south poles reversing positions. Rotation comes to a halt, begins to rotate in the opposite direction. The ocean basins empty onto the land in the former rotation direction until the water's momentum ceases. Then they begin to drain back into their basins. And the associated winds and barometric pressure excursions can create weather extremes depending on the speed of the reversal. Well, that's one of the keys here. The speed of the reversal. This reversal does not always happen the same way, the same degree. It does not necessarily jerk to a halt and suddenly run at full speed the other direction. It can, in theory, but it doesn't in practice. But there have been some pretty thrilling times in the history of the planet when the reversal was more severe than it was other times. What causes the severity? What causes the severity is the needs of the theater, the needs of the experience by the collective consciousness that sought to be in this theater, to invest in their physical experience here for reasons of soul development. And depending on what's going on in the collective consciousness, that will influence all of the programming and what degree of drama we see or we don't see. So that's one of the things that's not being talked about here in what I've seen. And if you begin to understand that, you realize you don't have to panic about this situation. And there are other reasons that I'll give you as we talk about it further. This isn't something where you have to go jump out of the window or to say, well, geez, I better build a really big mound and just hope that I'm one of the survivors, that I happen to be someplace on the earth where I'm able to survive. There were some of the mound builders that survived. A lot of them didn't. But, you know, just the fact that there's a nova happening is not the end of the story. There's a lot more to this in how it all works. This is an offshore shelf looking at what the land looks like underwater from off of Monterey. Here you see the fissures running down, the kind of thing you might see if you had a mountain there and there wasn't any water, the water running down the mountain. Except that these fissures, which are well established that they exist all over the world from the coasts, it's clear that water has run down there and cut those grooves. This wasn't because a crack opened up and created a fissure. This was something which was water erosion making cuts like the Grand Canyon in the surface. Here's another one in North Carolina, the North Carolina coast, the same kind of features. And they go down very, very deep. Well, how in the world would you ever have water cutting a trench down very deep when the ocean's in there? It's evidence of the fact that at least at times the oceans have spilled out of their basins and been up on the land and then run back in and cut these grooves. Douglas Vogt puts two and two together very nicely. This is the Tasmanian coast, same thing. All this texture that you see, all the grooves and all that, that's all underwater. alternative accounts appearing in this time from many sources that present a different view of history than what has been classically taught. Unfortunately, a great deal of what is taught by the school systems and higher education on the planet just isn't correct. And there's more and more information now coming into the world about what really has been going on. Artifacts are being discovered that are confirming some of these stories about what happened and confirming the truth behind what were being described as ancient myths. One source of confusion about the information that comes into the world has been the fact that Earth's historical accounts, some of the ones that are talked about as myths, for example, they occurred in higher dimensions. So sometimes you don't find the evidence in the third dimension because it didn't occur in the third dimension. It occurred in the fourth, or the fifth, or the sixth. And there are things which happened, which started out in higher dimensions and then subsequently devolved through the third dimension, so that there was evidence left at the end of a story, but at the beginning of the story, none of that information was around in the third dimension. Currently, there are third and fourth and fifth dimensional realities all represented on the planet, all at once, all at the same time. And it depends upon where you are here right at the moment as to whether you're experiencing a third dimensional reality, a fourth, or a fifth. And they have different operating systems and different things that are possible in those different locales at the moment. There was, in fact, an ancient civilization called Mu. Many people have heard of this. It's classically regarded as a myth by the academic community. It wasn't a myth at all, actually. Mu, or what many people have termed Lemuria, was in fact at one time a major continent in the Pacific. There is evidence out there. Lemurian ruins have been found undersea, offshore from Japan and Yonaguni. This is what Yonaguni ruins look like underwater off Japan. They were part of the continent of Lemuria before the geography changed. One of the reasons why people tend to dispute that this could be evidence of Lemuria is that there is this very inaccurate concept that things take a long time to change. They change very slowly. The reality is this planet has changed very rapidly, many, many times, and things have changed dramatically overnight at times. And that same naivety in the assumption spills over into dating technologies, carbon dating, and looking at radioactivity decay, which are supposed to be, according to classical physics, facts of life. You don't ever change those things. They enable you to date things very, very accurately. The fact of the matter is they don't. At times, those processes happen very quickly, and that fact has actually been proven in our time, in which radioactive decay rates using information fields have been made to change very, very rapidly, like within a day, by major degrees. And because of that, things like carbon dating and uranium decay rates and things like that used for dating, they may be accurate in the short term when it was linear, but the idea that that means that it's always been linear is quite false. And so a lot of the dating of things is being misunderstood and misreported. These are Lemurian ruins also on Easter Island. They were toward the later stages of the continent of Lemuria after it had broken up into islands. There were still parts of it that were part of the Lemurian civilization, and the figures on Easter Island are actually a remnant of that. And you probably noticed that at Yonaguni there's a very similar face there underwater. Looks an awful lot like somebody took it from Easter Island, brought it up to Japan and sank it. But it's evidence of Lemuria. Along the lines of ancient civilizations, there also was an ancient civilization after Mu called Atlantis. There was a higher technology civilization than we are now. known as Atlantis that was here 75,000 years ago. It had evolved to a global level of harmony. It developed some conflict within it over time, as sometimes things do, but it still was surviving to a level at which it was a virtual Garden of Eden here on this planet at that time. At one point, the Galactic Federation, which is a off-planet group who monitors what's going on in different theaters and was monitoring what was going on in our solar system, was aware that the population of the planet Mars was approaching a point at which it could no longer survive on its surface because of a history of warfare that had damaged the planet to the point that it had 3 million people that needed to be rescued and were requesting to be rescued from Mars. The Galactic Federation, in fact, agreed to rescue them and move them to the Earth on the basis of a promise that they made that they had learned their lesson with warfare and that they would be contributing members of the society. So they deposited them in Earth, right in the middle of Atlantis, and were given the opportunity to continue their experience on this sister planet. These are Atlantean ruins that are underwater off Jamaica. They're very old. They've been submerged, as has much of Atlantis at this point, much of the ruins of Atlantis. The refugees' influence on the peaceful Atlantis caused the development of weapons eventually, and bioengineering, where they were doing things like combining animals and people into beings that could be used as soldiers under the guise of a need for protection, that Atlantis really needed to take some steps to protect itself and its future. The culture began to be at odds with itself and with the planet, and the planet accordingly began to break up. The Atlantean culture, the Atlantean civilization, was originally a huge continent in the Atlantic Ocean that began about 300 miles off the coast of what now is the United States and ran all the way over to the Azores Islands off of Portugal, and had elements of it which ran east of there at a time when Western Africa actually didn't exist. The Atlantean continent began to break up as a result of this conflict between itself and the planet. Eventually, it was warned by the Galactic Federation that it needed to stop their warlike behavior and bring itself into greater harmony with the planet, or it would be destroyed. That was a prediction by the Galactic Confederation, but it was taken as a threat by the Atlantis government. And so they, in fact, decided to make a reprisal against the Galactic Confederation, viewing them as a threat at this point to their civilization. Ultimately, much of Atlantis went through a devolution of the civilization and downgraded from where it began, which was a sixth dimensional enterprise, down through the fifth, the fourth, and eventually the third dimension. This was what the attack conceptually looked like there. Here you're looking at a cartoon, which is the cross-section of the Earth. And the Atlanteans had developed very highly evolved technology based upon crystals and a crystalline grid that powered their civilization. They began to plan the redeployment of that power toward a weapon, and they decided to combine all of the crystalline inputs to the grid into the formation of a weapon which they would project toward the Galactic Confederation. Here you see the Galactic Confederation just shown as spaceships above the planet, and they in fact launched a weapon against the Galactic Confederation. The Galactic Confederation, however, had not been threatening them. They were actually just warning them of the consequences of their own actions. And when the Atlanteans projected this weapon up toward the Galactic Confederation with the idea of destroying it, the Galactic Federation had the technology to be able to send a combined wave back to the projected weapon and reflect it. And they reflected it back to Atlantis. It was reflected back down and struck the core of Atlantis, which had already begun to break up as a continent, but still had a substantial amount of large islands and big segments. The weapon was actually a graviton bomb, and it was reflected back, struck Atlantis, and in one day submerged Atlantis below the surface of the ocean by 3 miles. It sank 3 miles in one day and destroyed the core of that civilization's government and leadership. There were still pieces of Atlantis elsewhere in the Atlantic, but there was an enormous reaction to that. The conflagration that was the equivalent of 10,000 atomic bombs at once, and it not only drove Atlantis below the surface of the ocean and obliterated its center, but it also rose up into the stratosphere of the planet with all kinds of debris that was reflected back by the rising fireball. That then drifted over to the east and fell, but meanwhile there was an enormous amount of ocean and mud and sand and gravel that were reflected out from the surface of the planet in a big tidal wave and covered over other portions of the planet that it could reach at that time. Here you see some evidence of the major Atlantean destruction. Here you're looking at the desert in western Egypt, where there are perhaps several thousand tons of fused quartz glass, is beautiful green quartz glass on the surface of the desert there. And it covers about 2,300 square miles of the desert. Scientists have looked at this glass and puzzled over it. How did it form? There is no other glass on Earth like it. It's actually high purity quartz, high purity fused silica, which is 97% quartz. It has a greenish color, probably due to tiny amounts of iron that were in it, but it had clearly been fused into a glass. There is no natural glass on the planet that matches it, partly because to get fused quartz to melt like that requires about 1,800 degrees centigrade. That's like bright white heat as a minimum to melt it, let alone to melt it in a flash. Feasible to do with a graviton bomb, where you have the equivalent of 10,000 atomic bombs and the heat from that. This is part of the debris that rained out of the sky east of there on the Egyptian desert. The Egyptian desert prior to that wasn't a desert. That was sand from off the bottom of the ocean that was displaced up in a big tidal wave and formed the Sahara Desert. But there was a lot of other fill and change to the Earth at that time. This was one piece of the evidence. In fact, one individual from Sandia did a computer modeling of what kind of energy would be required to produce all that fused glass and spread a large debris field, and concluded that it would take more than the energy of 10,000 atomic bombs to do that. And since they didn't know of any culture on the planet that could have done that, they began to look for other answers, and they said, well, the only way you could get that much energy would be like a big meteor strike or an asteroid hitting Earth. But there's no crater. There's no crater they can point to that. So finally they said, well, it must have been an asteroid or a meteor or something that burst in the air, and you had an air burst and it created this. But actually any of the asteroid or meteor debris which has been found to date, even when it has fused glass from the rock and stuff like that and from the heat, it isn't this beautiful green, clear, high purity silica glass. But if you take high purity sand and you melt it, you come out with 97% silica. There aren't any debris on the Earth that match that and really explain that, and there's no crater to show where, in fact, locally that could have been formed. There's never been any volcanic glass to match that. It is evidence of the final destruction of the core of Atlantis, down to a level where it was now a number of islands and one fairly good-sized piece which was moved what we call south nowadays, by the instabilities that were generated on the planet by that impact. Here you're looking, interestingly, at what was found much later as Tutankhamun's quartz scarab necklace. In the middle, you see a piece of that green glass. And Tutankhamun actually had that glass carved into a scarab, not because, oh, hey, there's a really nice gem here. As a matter of fact, when they first found this necklace, they thought it was a gem, and then with testing, they said, well, it's high purity quartz glass. And they later realized that it appeared to be the same glass that was scattered all over the western desert. And so with more than 1,000 tons of that glass out there, a king as rich as King Tut wouldn't put it in the middle of his necklace unless it were a matter of its significance. And its significance was to remind him of what had happened in the past when people got too arrogant and they attempted to oppose something like the Galactic Confederation that had way more technology than they did or ever would. Anyway, it's evidence of the history of Atlantis. Here you see a more recently discovered ancient site called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, which is a megalithic site that they're unearthing now, and they're wondering, why did the people bury this site? They didn't bury it. That's what happened to the sand and the gravel and the earth that got blown out of the bottom of the ocean and swept over an tidal wave and buried it then. That's how it got buried. So actually that inundation with earth and gravel was part of the destruction of the major civilization of Atlantis. Similarly, there have been pyramids discovered in Eastern Europe, Poland, big pyramids, which they haven't been able to unearth yet. Those weren't as far east as they are now, but they also were inundated by what came out of the destruction of Atlantis in the great tidal waves. That's how they got buried. Here you're looking at another part of the Atlantean civilization that was inundated with water in its eventual destruction. A latter part of the Atlantean Empire was down toward Bimini in the West Indies, and here to the left you see a slide of the so-called Bimini Road, which is a megalithic site down there that actually was part of Atlantis at one time. There's some other debris found near there also that were cylinders that you can see underwater there. Again, part of the destroyed Atlantis. There was subsequently to that a solar nova 24,000 years ago, 2 cycles ago, which created global flooding. And that actually was Noah's flood. That was the result of a polar reversal which spilled out a considerable amount of the ocean up onto the land and then subsided, and Noah, of course, survived that flood. Here you're looking at a historical timeline of the various things I've been talking about. To the left there, you see mankind brought to Earth originally. Mankind was originally brought to Earth as refugees ourselves. People talk about ETs and all of that. We's them. We were not originally here, but we were brought here as refugees, just like the Martians were, but much earlier. Lemuria was a 5th dimensional civilization, and it began about 100,000 years ago now. It lasted until about 80,000 years, whereupon by then it had devolved to a 4th dimensional civilization. The beginning of Atlantis 5,000 years later was a 6th dimensional civilization, and originally in its harmony it was a matriarchy. It was actually sisterhoods that ran that civilization, not brotherhoods. And actually it was the influence of the Martians when they came here, which turned it eventually into a patriarchy and brotherhoods and the masculine leadership. The last king of Atlantis was a king named Atlas. The Martian refugees were brought to Atlantis when it was in the 5th dimension, 60,000 years ago. About 15,000 years after it began. It had already devolved from 6th density to 5th density at that time because the Martians came here, and after a while converting it to a patriarchy, it has slipped to a 4th density enterprise at about 50,000 years ago. And with the warfare on the planet and attempting to conquer others, and the development of weapons and all of that, about 36,000 years ago, it became a third-dimensional civilization. So it had slipped from the sixth dimension to the third. Atlantis was destroyed in the attack on the Confederation 24,000 years ago. And right after that, there was a lot of Earth cataclysms, and there was a polar reversal, which was more cataclysmic, which was just after the Atlantean attack on the Confederation. Later on, 4,000 years later, the part that had been sank 3 miles below the surface eventually surfaced again, about 20,000 years ago. And it surfaced in West Africa, and at that point, West Africa, as we know it today, came to the surface. That is, Egypt in the more ancient days was part of the eastern part of Atlantis, and it did not extend all the way to, well, at the time of the attack on the Confederation, a lot of its central core sank, but there was what is now Libya and West Africa, Mauritania, those didn't exist as land masses at 24,000 years ago at that point, but they joined Africa as land masses 20,000 years ago after that whole epic. There was a Greek named Herodotus who made a map which shows what the civilization looked like 2,500 years ago, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. After the Atlantean resurface, eventually there was a final destruction of Atlantis. That occurred 12,700 years ago. And there was an ice age. At 12,000 years, a substantial part of that ice age melted with the most previous nova, and there was less ice on the world, more water, until our time now, when again the ice caps are starting to melt further as the sun gets hotter right now. Here you see a Earth photo which came from the U.S. Geological Survey showing pyramids showing through the ice now as the ice is melting in Atlantis. Those pyramids were originally part of Atlantis, but that continent that is underneath the ice there was originally farther north in our geography than it is now. The Earth had become unstable and it had migrated south. Interesting that there is actually evidence of that landmass that's known and has been known for a long time. Here's an image of Antarctica showing a part of Antarctica known as Queen Maud Land. Belongs to the Norwegians, I believe. You can see the purple stars are the locations of some of the pyramids showing through the surface now as the ice melts back. Here you see the orientation of Antarctica and those pyramids relative to South America and Africa. At the time of Atlantis, that landmass was considerably farther north in the Atlantic Ocean, but it had migrated there and then eventually was covered with ice. Here is a map, an ancient map of Turkish Admiral PIRI REIS, which was drawn in 1513, which is showing actually the landmass of Antarctica before the ice cap. The map of PIRI REIS was, according to his own accounts, put together from about 20 ancient maps, which actually showed that landmass. And right now, where it's all kind of brown, it's a little hard to see what's what. And if you look at current Antarctica, the total of all of what you're looking at there is actually the continent of Antarctica, including the ice. And the brown part is actually the land under it. And what is Queen Maud Land was actually part of Atlantis at one point. Here you're looking at PIRI REIS map without the water in the map. That's what it looked like. On the left is part of South America and is joining a landmass down in the bottom, which actually is part of Antarctica now. Here, if you looked at the left, the projection of PIRI REIS map, the landmass has been modified slightly to render it more appropriate to a spherical map. Then on the right-hand side, you see the other map that I was showing you, showing the landmass of Antarctica, and in the middle, you see the one placed over the other, and if you look at it carefully, it actually matches the ancient 1513 map with its portion of Antarctica to the current land under Antarctica, which has only been known since like 1949 with some sonic mapping below the ice. Interesting that part of Atlantis was actually on the ancient maps. Here's a geological phenomenon called the Eye of the Sahara. You're looking at an aerial photo of it here. It's what the geologists call a REICHAT structure, and it's located in Mauritania, West Africa. It's on part of the land which I mentioned eventually rose and became part of West Africa only about 20,000 years ago. There's a YouTube video by a guy named Jimmy called Bright Insights talking about the Eye of the Sahara REICHAT structure and Plato's description of Atlantis in ancient times, comparing the two, comparing what Plato said about the original Atlantis and the REICHAT structure. The first thing is that there is a relevant map here, and I'll show it to you in a minute, which shows part of West Africa. Back 2,500 years ago, it was put together by HERODOTUS. And Mauritania, which is currently where the REICHAT structure is, was reputed to have been the land of the Maoris. They were an ancient people. And the first king of the Maoris was named Atlas, who actually happened to have been the last king of Atlantis when it sank. And interestingly, on Herodotus's map, you would see where in northwest Africa, Mauritania, there are some mountains. They're called the Atlas Mountains. Interesting coincidence. They're labeled on the map north of the REICHAT structure. And Plato's Atlantis description described 5 rings to the center of Atlantis, 3 of which were water and 2 of which were land. They were concentric rings. And they were in the same pattern as the REICHAT structure. And as a matter of fact, they had the same dimensions as the REICHAT structure. And Plato recited in his writings that there was a freshwater spring. Remember, this part of Atlantis in Plato's description was surrounded by the ocean at that point, salt water. It had a freshwater spring right in the middle of it. As it turns out, the REICHAT structure has a freshwater spring right in the middle of it. And the surrounding wells to the REICHAT structure are salt water, even though they're on land today. It's been acknowledged now that there's some kind of volcanic anomaly beneath the REICHAT structure. And you will remember that this part of West Africa rose up above the ocean and came back, and which would have required some kind of tectonic movement and probably volcanic anomaly to do that. Perhaps most interestingly, on the Herodotus map, the area where the REICHAT structure is labeled Atlantis. A-T-L-A-N-T-E-S. There also have been whale bones found in the desert of Mauritania. These are not fossils, these are whale bones. And they're nowhere near the water. This is the desert. So when it rose out of the water, it apparently had been exposed to sea life, and in fact there are reputed to be other evidence of fish there in the desert and seashells and things like that. So this was all pointed out by Jimmy of Bright Insights, and I think he's quite correct. Here's Herodotus's map. On the left-hand side, south of the Mediterranean Sea, you see Atlantis, and above the word Atlantis, there's some mountains drawn there. Those are the Atlas Mountains, and you can see what were called the Pillars of Hercules, which is where Gibraltar is, which is what Plato described as being before you get to Atlantis. In fact, if this land was Atlantean, it moved east after 4,000 years of being submerged. This is the map in Herodotus' time, about 2,500 years ago. Here's an illustration of Atlantis from Plato's description, which somebody made and put on the crystal-link site. Here's a comparison of the Eye of the Sahara and the RECHAT structure. The one on the right is, in fact, the center of Atlantis having resurfaced. The one on the left was Plato's description of Atlantis back when it was in the Atlantic. So disclosures have been coming out with surprising information. Disclosures that are appearing with increasing persistence over our lifetimes as to the presence of many types of star beings on Earth from other realms. And the evidence for it has been expanding dramatically. There's lots of stuff coming into the public eye now, including the so-called Disclosure Project, which is around nearly 20 years old, where 100 people that were government employees, airline pilots, air traffic controllers, military people, and military pilots and all that were talking about their experiences with so-called ETs. And there's been a consistent effort on the part of the government to say that this is all nonsense, this isn't true, and often ludicrous attempts to conceal it, such as after the appearance of stuff in New Mexico in the 1940s, and an announcement to the newspapers that they'd found a flying saucer. Then we get this nonsense coming out from the military subsequently of, oh no, it was a weather balloon, we were mistaken. Anyway, there's a lot of stuff coming into the world now that seems to indicate that indeed there have been and are many other star beings on Earth from other realms. The interesting thing about that, the mainstream effort, I believe, has been to try to ridicule and try to create fear in humanity of people from other realms. And the irony is that humanity in its current form isn't indigenous to Earth. We weren't here at first ourselves. We weren't the first humanoids on this planet. And we're not indigenous to Earth, and we are ourselves star beings, having come originally from Lyra, where we were created in our current physical form, and then brought here as refugees 300,000 years ago. The fact is that hundreds of thousands of star beings actually have been living among us incognito for many, many thousands of years. And as you'll come to appreciate, they may well be part of the solution to our needs, as opposed to invaders and kidnappers and all of this, where they got so much press about the cattle mutilations and the abductees, which was a tiny amount of that kind of thing happening compared with the many, many thousands of star beings that have been here and aren't doing anything like that, and actually are living among us in many cases unknown to most people. They're humanoids that have, most of them, limited variations in their appearance from us, some more than others, but they actually have been very helpful and are potentially helpful to us in being here. They include Pleiadians, Sirians, Regulans, Cygnans, Centaurians, Lyrans, Procyons, Mantis, Reptilians, to name a few. I've often been intrigued by some of the statues and engravings of Akhenaten, the pharaoh, and his queen Nefertiti, who you see here with the child, and you look at them and you say, wow, you know, somebody's either a really bad artist or these people didn't look very much like us. I mean, yeah, they got two legs and a head and feet and all of that, but they got this big belly and big thighs and small legs, skinny legs, and small arms and elongated skulls, as it happens, which is one of the reasons for the headdress that they were wearing. It had to fit their elongated skull. And Tutankhamun, their son, when they opened his tomb, he has an elongated skull as well, and he has some of those similar body features as well. These people were star beings. They were not just deformed people or human beings in the same degree as us, but they were certainly capable of operating among us. And because Akhenaten took the pharaohic leadership in a direction toward the belief in one God and outlawing the multiple gods, which put him at odds with the priesthood, they obviously had a target on his back, and eventually he wasn't the pharaoh. Anyway, they were a rather public example of star beings that have been here in antiquity and had a lot of public note. There have been on the news, as you probably know, recent fires in Paradise, California. There are among our repertoire of technologies and defense structure, space-based masers. A maser is actually the forerunner of the laser. The first masers were lasers that were essentially in the microwave range, which can focus a very high-powered microwave beam on a target and obliterate it with a tremendous amount of heat using microwave energy. And we have space-based masers. They were supposed to be part of the Strategic Defense Initiative. A lot of them ended up pointing toward the Earth. In fact, they were used against targets in California for the purpose of preventing a disclosure of the existence of ETs. There were some star beings who have been living there among us in Paradise, California from Alpha Centauri. And in fact, there was a plan to make that public. And the few attempting to control the many, who still at the moment control some of those space-based masers, decided to make sure that didn't happen. And so they targeted some of the people involved with that and created some fires. Here's a melted car in Paradise, California. That doesn't happen in a forest fire. You're looking at the frozen melt of having melted the engine there with a space-based maser. And that was an attempt to keep the truth from coming out, that in fact there are star beings here, and they've been living among us for a long time, and that's true many places, and they're part of the solution, not part of the problem. If you're a few trying to control the many, you really don't want to see those people too much, and you don't want to get them allied with the people you're trying to control. Anyway, there are disclosures coming out, and there will be more disclosures coming out about the existence of highly capable, completely compatible star beings that live here and are here to assist. One way in which you will see some assistance is in the coming nova. Quoting the metaphysician Mary Baker Eddy, we're experiencing Earth's preparatory school. This is a theater in which we're simply evolving as spiritual beings, having experiences, and all of this is part and parcel of the wonderful fabric of drama that we've chosen to experience. It's a preparatory school that is periodically overhauled and freshened up a bit when, in fact, we've abused it too badly or it's in need of refreshing. And that's what's actually going on here. And that's what goes on in the novas. Earth has had 4 different dimensional experiences occurring here among the human population over the last 100,000 years, ranging from the 6th dimension, 4th, 5th, and 3rd, down to presently the 3rd and 4th, and beginning to be the 5th. The sun has now shifted from 3rd dimensional to a 4th dimensional sun. A 3rd dimensional sun is yellow. A 4th dimensional sun is bright white. And that's what our sun is doing right now, being a bright white sun. It's a 4th dimensional sun, and the planet increasingly is moving toward becoming a 4th dimensional planet. It's actually, with the 4th dimensional sun, it officially is a 4th dimensional planet, but we still have some 3rd dimensional experiences occurring here on Earth, which have not stopped yet. What will happen? What will happen is the separation soon between the 3rd dimensional experiences and the 4th. They will not be the same reality. They will be separate realities. They're not even the same reality right now. There are parts of the planet that are perfectly harmonious where people are living in harmony, they're experiencing an increasing degree of harmony, and other parts of the planet where there's a lot of turmoil. If you think about your own lives, you're not in the big turmoil out there. You're not being bombed into oblivion and dying in earthquakes and tsunamis. You're having a life which hopefully is getting better. One of the things that's happening as the vibration, so to speak, of this reality keeps rising is all of our junk keeps boiling up to be dealt with emotionally. All of the past negative emotions that we've experienced, we still carry around until we let them go. And they're boiling up for us to deal with them and get over them and let them go to keep our frequencies in harmony with the rising fourth dimensional frequency of the planet. And we're on a path to do that. But there's a portion of the population who is not ready for fourth density experience, that isn't finished with the dramas that they've been going through all over the planet in various areas. And those people, some of them will choose in the coming months and few years to leave the planet in various ways and end this experience. But there are many, and the majority of them, that will not choose to leave the planet, but are not ready to be part of a fourth dimensional planet that's only fourth dimensional. What will happen with them is that they actually will be transferred off the planet. Now that sounds preposterous, considering there are, pick your number, 6.5 to 7 billion people on the planet. How do you do that? Well, in fact, the Galactic Confederation and the star beings that have far better technologies than we do are perfectly capable of doing that and have done that many times. They moved 3 million Martians here. They moved us here. And they do that from time to time when things go through their regeneration cycles, the 75,000 year more dramatic overhauls of these theaters. They do that kind of thing routinely. There are currently thousands of spaceships watching this planet, waiting to serve to move the bulk of the population from 3D Earth to another 3D location similar to Earth to continue their experience. And they will. And they'll get them there the same way they got the Martians here, and the same way they got us here. And that kind of thing happens, and that you will see happen in this time. Those who are able to get their frequency up high enough will stay on the planet. They will stay on the planet because they're not going to experience the regeneration cycle that the third dimension experiences. The regeneration cycle in the fourth dimension is a different reality. It will be harmonious, and we don't have to worry about that. If we're not going to make the shift, that's okay. We will be transplanted unless we choose to just end the experience, and that's okay too. Nobody ends their experience on this planet without, at some soul level, they agree to it. They may not consciously, at their lowest level of consciousness, feel like they've agreed to it. But at their highest level, when they're done with the experience, they cash out. And they're still around, and they have other incarnations, etc. So that's what's going on, is there's a trifurcation of the population. There will be, at some point, I believe, a solar flash, which will be the separation of the third dimensional and fourth dimensional realities. And it will be solely a fourth dimensional reality going forward on this planet for a while. I think we're on a roll here right now where society is waking up, where people are learning, and the people that will inherit the earth, so to speak, are the ones that are choosing harmony and capable of sustaining it. So I think we're in store in the fourth density experience for progressive harmony, and there also will be a long-term protection now afforded by the Galactic Confederation to the fourth density Earth for a while. For a while, in this case, is 1,000 years, in protection in one respect, and that is not allowing star people who haven't learned to come in and create warfare and disharmony here, but allow us 1,000 years to evolve. The world, I'm totally convinced is way more amazing than we would ever guess. We just need to focus on creating what we want. And that's way more significant than you might even imagine, in that you not only can change the future, you can change the past. And that's what this Mandela effect, which people are starting to see, that's actually what that is in the process of creating a future, they're actually changing some of the history. And that's possible. It's all a theater. It's all a story being written by our collective consciousness, and it's a matter of what we prefer and what we choose. The bottom line is everyone's needs will be met one way or the other, and you don't have to go jump out of the window because of the disclosures that are happening. They're all part of a purpose being fulfilled. I thank you for listening. There are additional perspectives from time to time on additional topics that will be forthcoming.